Journey Outside by Mary Q. Steele, Chapter 10. Welcome back to Chapter 10 of Journey Outside by Mary Q. Steele. Dilar has decided that he wants to leave, but he couldn't get out the door because he is not as big as Wingo to move the stone from the opening of the cave. So here we go. Chapter 10. Wingo tossed the last crumbs out upon the snow. "Ah, boy, you look gloomy these days," he scolded. "No need to look gloomy. See our friends the birds, how cheerful they are in spite of the cold and snow." Dilar frowned. "I am not a bird," he said distinctly. "I'm a boy. Crumbs are not enough to make me cheerful." "That may be so," Wingo agreed. "Still better crumbs than hunger in the days of winter. Besides, winter will soon be over." "No, it won't," responded Dilar darkly. "It will go on forever." Wingo laughed and shook his head. "Spring is on the way. Come, I'll show you." He began to walk through the trees, going off toward the morning sun, a way he and Dilar had never ventured before. Dilar followed eagerly. He longed for something different to happen, something besides baking and eating and feeding the birds. And perhaps Wingo would really show him some signs of coming spring. In spite of himself, Dilar could not get over the notion that the snow and cold were endless and unchanging. They walked in snow almost unmarked, except by an occasional track of a slender foot or the brush of a big wing. Dilar wanted to ask Wingo how he found his way so easily, for the big man did not hesitate, but went forward swiftly, and for once hardly spoke. "There now, there it is!" exclaimed Wingo at length. And Dilar looked around, not knowing what to expect and not seeing anything except the snowy landscape. But Wingo hurried forward and Dilar followed. To his surprise, they stood suddenly on the mountain's edge at the top of a long, steep slope looking down into that valley Dilar had never hoped to see, the one beyond the mountains of the tigers. What lay below them was a curiously colored, gently moving mist. But somewhere across the fog, low hills shouldered into view. "See," cried Wingo, pointing. "The hills are bare of snow. There's even a little green on the slope. Can you see?" Dilar shaded his eyes with his hands. He thought he saw. He wanted to see. He leaned forward, trying hard to see, and then suddenly, horribly, sickeningly, his feet were sliding. He was slipping. He gasped and flung out his arms and laid hold of nothing, and saw the world whirl around him, and then was rolling, spinning, slithering straight down the mountain. He was hurled against a rock and then over a small ledge, landing jarringly on the soft snow beneath, and sledded swiftly over it, bounced into a stunted bush, and grabbed for it frantically as the twigs broke in his fingers, rolled again down and down and down, and fell over another ledge, scratching and clawing to save himself from going over, trying desperately to slow himself, but vainly nothing offered itself to his hands, and he dropped, gasping, half fainting, into empty space. He plunged into the snow as into the river, and it closed over his head, over his eyes, over his open mouth. He thrashed around in it, striking out as though he were truly swimming, and his feet struck the bottom, and he thought quite clearly, "The snow kept me from being killed," for he had landed almost gently, but it would kill him if he stayed in it, drown him, smother him, freeze him. He was already buried, entombed in snow. By frenzied kicking and flopping about, at last he touched something solid and pulled himself up out of the snow-filled hole into which he had fallen and onto a wide rock shelf where the snow was only ankle-deep. He lay on it, taking great sobbing breaths, still seeing stars and snow flash before his eyes, hardly able to focus on the world around him, a dim, unreal place in its steadiness. Presently his sight cleared, and the sound of his own panting grew less, and he could in the silence suddenly hear Wingo's great voice bellowing from far above him. "Dilar! Boy! Dilar! Are you there? Can you hear me?" Dilar sat up and pressed his hands to his head, but he could not answer. To save his life, he could not squeeze any sort of noise out of his chest. With trembling hands, he untied Wingo's scarf from around his throat and chin. It was a bright scarf, a warm red-brown, and he waved it feebly a few times. Wingo continued calling, and after a bit Diller waved the scarf again and then spread it out on the snow where he hoped it could be seen. "I see you, boy!" cried Wingo. "I see you! Don't move! I'll fetch a rope and pull you up! Just sit there and take care! I won't be long!" Diller huddled in the snow, waiting. He ached from head to foot. He was bruised and scraped and scuffed all over. His arms felt as though they had been half pulled from their sockets, and his head ached piercingly. It would be a long time before Wingo returned, he knew. It was several miles to the cave, and then another several back to the mountain's edge. Diller could not help thinking that he would die before the big man brought the rope. He picked up a handful of snow and pressed it to the knot on his forehead. After a while, he felt better. He wasn't really hurt, only jolted and scratched. The sun had come out and shone warmly on his back, calming and comforting him. He stood up and carefully stretched and flexed his arms and legs. He was surprised to find that they worked as well as ever. He moved around on the ledge, rubbing a bruise here and there, and suddenly smiling a little as he pictured himself plunging down the cliffs. He remembered how Katrin had said that going down the mountain was quicker than going up, and he wondered if this was what he meant. The ledge on which he stood was a fairly wide one. In the clean snow along its rim ran the sharp little tracks of an antelope. They vanished abruptly as though the antelope had leaped into space, and Diller went to look. At that spot a steep path wound away below him, and the antelope had evidently descended on it. For several minutes Diller stood following the tracks with his eyes until they disappeared, and below that point was the strange fog filling the valley. Diller peered into it for a space. Suddenly he turned around and picked up the scarf, and then he said softly, "Goodbye, Wingo," and he set his feet where the antelope's hoofs had marked the way. He slid and slipped but did not fall. Going carefully, putting his feet down slowly, crouching where the drop seemed steeper than he could manage standing, he journeyed down the slopes. Once he turned his head and looked back the way he had come, but the sun on the snow dazzled him, and he had to turn his eyes away. But the snow around him was disappearing. Rocks and dried grasses and weeds poked up through the thin skin of snow. Only in cracks between the rocks and in occasional hollows was it any longer drifted deep. Before he had scrambled downward another hour, the path itself was clear, and there lay before him a narrow, rough, pebbly way. As he went on, the day grew dim. At first he thought the sun was setting, for he did not really know how long that he had been going down and down. Then he saw he had reached the level of the mist, that he was descending into those curious clouds, dull blue and brass and copper and brown, gray, and lavender and maroon, slowly boiling and twisting, writhing in long ropes and dissolving into pools and erupting into fat spreading columns. Diller glanced up and found he could not see the sun and the mountains, yet the haze around him was not as thick and blinding as it had appeared to be from the mountain's face. He could see things ahead of him easily enough, as if he were walking through a stormy twilight. He stopped to take off the cape that Norna had given him, for he was growing warm in it, and he realized that there was no trace of snow anywhere around him. The ground still went downward, but very gradually. The pebbles had changed to smooth sand, and there was nothing to see in all that opalescent mist, except here and there a big boulder looming through it. The haze drifting and spiraling in the little restless winds, now thick, now thin, now blue, now brown, made distances hard to judge. Near things were suddenly far away, and distant rocks were in 2 steps close enough to touch. It was a strange landscape, even to Diller, and he hesitated. Perhaps he should have thought twice before leaving Wingo and his pantries and his baking. Perhaps there was another way off the mountain which ended somewhere else, a place different from this eerie region of no shadows and no light, no trees, no animals, no people, only the formless murk and the glossless shifting colors. It was useless to think of going back. He did not now believe he could retrace his steps and find his way once again up the mountain. What lay behind him was as dim and unmarked as what lay in front. Anyway, he had begun to feel that going back would be a mistake, that whatever happened, he had to go on until he found whatever it was he was seeking. He was glad that he had not, after all, turned back to Norna's house. He went on. The earth flattened and grew more sandy. There was no indication of a path. The winds picked up the fine dust, the wind picked up the fine dust and blew it this way and that. Looking up, Diller found no sun, no moon, no clouds, no stars. He stumbled on. He passed some curious lumpy things like plants covered with thin, sharp thorns. A lizard as long as an arm ran in front of him, and several times he heard what he thought must be animals barking fairly close to him, and once a bird of some sort croaked strangely overhead. All these things, queer and dry and alien as they were, made Diller feel a little better, for even a lizard for company was better than thinking himself alone, the only living creature in a mysterious dead world. He was tired and hungry and thirsty, but he did not know any remedy for his discomforts and plodded on, mile after mile. It had now grown so dim that he assumed it was night. He looked about him and saw only rocks and the dumpy plants and drifts of sand, just as he had seen them now for hours. He might as well have been walking in circles, for nothing changed except the wash of color through the mists, blues chasing grays, chasing reds, in a thin film that his eyes could barely catch. Everywhere he looked it was the same, and he was afraid. He walked on, for he could not think of another thing to do. At last he came to some rocks which seemed different, 3 grouped together, huge and dark, and leaning a little toward each other. He was grateful for the sight. If he had passed them before, he was almost certain he would have remembered them. He went closer, and in the dimness the rocks looked menacing and enormous, and made him tremble a little. But he forced himself to go in among them, and there in the center of the 3, it was sheltered from the winds, and gave some impression of safety and protection. It was chilly, but not cold. At last Diller lay down on the sand, and pulled his cape over his head and face, and slept. He woke still tired and sore from his fall, hungry and stiff and terribly thirsty. Once again the darkness had lessened, but he did not know whether it was morning, noon, or evening. He stepped out from the circle of rocks and could not remember which way he had come or how he had planned to go on, but he wasted no time thinking of these things. Instead he set out, any way, any road. It did not matter as long as he was moving. He could not bear to think of sitting or standing still in this uncanny place. His thirst grew worse and worse, and his tongue felt like a stick of wood in his mouth. When he tried to swallow, he coughed sharply instead. There must be water somewhere, spring or pool or well. There must be water, for he had heard animals and a bird, and they must surely have water to live. He almost laughed to think that he, a boy of the raft people, half fish, his days spent in the water as much as out, should die of thirst. He walked on. His throat was choked with dryness. He could feel the strange small wind sucking the juices from him as they blew from every direction. He grew so wretched he forgot to look for springs or pools and simply walked on, staring straight ahead and hardly thinking at all. So, Diller would have passed the man if the man had not been directly in his way. He was standing, head thrown back, eyes closed, dressed in a dirty, unsewn garment tied at the shoulders and hanging in rags about his knees, his hands raised above his head and his matted hair streaming down his body. He did not turn at Diller's approach. He did not lower his head or move. Diller strained to speak, but his throat was closed with thirst. He took a step nearer and put a hand on the man's shoulder. "Water!" he gasped at last, in a voice cracked and harsh with dryness. At first the man did not move, but then he stepped away from Diller as though shaking off a vine that had brushed annoyingly against him. "Water!" croaked Diller again, and this time the man seemed to have heard. He lowered his head and arms and opened his eyes and drew from somewhere at his side a sharp stone knife. Dun, 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 dun. Looks like he's still talking on this page, so he must live. Let's not give up hope. If you liked Journey Outside, you may want to try one of these books: City of Ember, The Giver, Farrell's, Tomorrow Girls, Everland, or maybe a graphic novel, The City of Embers, Five Worlds, Milo's World.